The C-704 anti-ship missile hit the water 9 meters from the USS Sirocco's hull, and the explosion blew the starboard inflatable boat clean off its davits, drove a 3-inch steel fragment through the bridge wing armor plate, and knocked every person on the starboard side of the ship to the deck simultaneously. 9 meters, the closest a warhead has come to an American naval hull in this operational record without making contact. The crew of the Sirocco had 7 seconds of warning, not 7 minutes. 7 seconds between the fire control radar's activation and the moment the C-704 hit the water 9 meters from 28 American sailors. Welcome to U.S. Defense Review, where we reconstruct the engagements, the margins, and the compressed decisions that define what American naval presence in the Persian Gulf costs when the adversary fires before the warning system has time to generate a warning. The USS Sirocco is a Cyclone-class patrol craft. 170 feet, 330 tons, crew of 28. It carries 25mm chain guns and .50 caliber mounts. It does not have an Aegis combat system. It does not have SM-2 interceptor cells. It does not have any capability to intercept an inbound anti-ship missile at range. What it has is a Phalanx CIWS for close-in defense, a crew trained to fight the ship they have, and an EW detection suite that on this morning gave them 7 seconds between first radar emission and a detonation at 9 meters. The Sirocco had been operating in the western Persian Gulf for 9 hours on a routine patrol, the same patrol sector it had been assigned for 3 days running. The battery that fired it had been at its launch position for an estimated 4 hours before the engagement, a position on the Iranian coast 24 nautical miles to the north, on a piece of shoreline that satellite imagery had not flagged as active during the most recent pre-transit intelligence review. The 4-hour pre-positioning had happened during the imagery gap between the most recent satellite pass and the engagement. 4 hours was enough to move the launcher vehicle into position, compute the firing solution on the Sirocco's predictable patrol track, load the C-704, and wait. The C-704's launch technique was the tactical evolution that made 7 seconds possible. Standard anti-ship missile launches use the fire control radar to develop the complete targeting solution before launch. The radar goes active, tracks the target, computes the solution, and then the missile launches. This technique means the fire control radar is active for minutes before launch, and the target ship's EW suite detects the emission with time to generate a warning and potentially maneuver or engage. The battery that fired on the Sirocco used a different sequence. Inertial launch first, fire control radar refinement second. The C-704 was launched on a pre-computed inertial navigation solution, a solution developed before the fire control radar activated, using previously collected data on the Sirocco's patrol track geometry. The fire control radar activated after the missile was airborne, refining its terminal guidance in flight. The result? The Sirocco's AN/SLQ-32 detected the fire control radar emission at 03:14:53. The C-704 had already launched 1 second earlier at 03:14:52. The missile was in the air, inbound, guidance radar now active, and the ship had from the moment of detection to the moment of impact to respond. 7 seconds at the engagement geometry. 7 seconds. The watch officer acknowledged the threat alert at 03:14:54. The commanding officer was on the bridge by 03:14:56. The flash distress transmission, 6 words, missile inbound, Sirocco, position follows, went out at 3:14:57. The position data followed in 2 more seconds. At 3:15, the C-704 hit the water 9 meters from the starboard hull. The Phalanx CIWS, the only system the Sirocco had that could have engaged the missile in that 7-second window, was in scheduled maintenance. It had been taken offline the previous evening for a routine service cycle that its maintenance schedule required every 120 operating hours. The maintenance had been scheduled before the Western Gulf's threat assessment had been elevated 3 days earlier. It had not been suspended when the elevation occurred. This detail, the CIWS in maintenance when the missile hit, is the operational failure that the post-incident review would examine most carefully. But that examination was still days away. At 3:15, the commanding officer of the USS Sirocco was picking himself off the deck and running his crew assessment. Ship status: minor external damage, no flooding, propulsion functional. The explosion had been 9 meters out, and the overpressure and fragmentation had hit the exposed starboard surfaces. The davits, the bridge wing, the exterior electronics on the starboard side, but had not penetrated the hull or damaged the propulsion systems. The Sirocco could move. Crew status: 4 down on the starboard side from overpressure. Multiple crew members picking themselves off the deck throughout the ship from the blast concussion. The corpsman was moving. Nobody confirmed dead. Multiple possible concussions. Threat status: the battery that had fired was 24 nautical miles north. Its fire control radar was still active, now tracking the Sirocco post-impact. C704 reload cycle estimate: 12 to 15 minutes. The CIWS was offline. The nearest armed support, any support, was 31 nautical miles away. The commanding officer processed all 3 assessments in the 9 seconds between picking himself up and giving his first order. His first order was not a call for help. CENTCOM had the flash transmission from 03-1457 and was already moving. His first order was to the helm: maximum speed, bearing 135 away from the battery's position. The Sirocco at maximum sprint runs approximately 37 knots under emergency power. On bearing 135, sprinting at 37 knots, it would increase its standoff from the battery at approximately 700 meters per minute. The battery was 24 nautical miles away. The effective range of the C704 is approximately 35 kilometers, approximately 19 nautical miles. The Sirocco needed to reach 20 nautical miles standoff to exit the C704's effective range. It was at 24. It needed to open the range by 4 nautical miles before the battery completed its reload. 4 nautical miles at 37 knots takes approximately 6 minutes and 30 seconds. The reload estimate was 12 to 15 minutes. The Sirocco had margin 3.5 minutes to 6.5 minutes of safety buffer between achieving minimum safe standoff and the battery being ready to fire again. The commanding officer did not stop at minimum safe standoff. He kept the sprint running until the ship reached 30 nautical miles from the battery position, a deliberate 11 nautical mile buffer beyond the C704's effective range limit. He reached 30 nautical miles at 03:24:41, 9 minutes and 41 seconds after the near miss. At 3:26:44, 11 minutes and 44 seconds after the first launch, the battery's fire control radar activated again. The Sirocco's EW suite detected it immediately. The radar was active and tracking. The Sirocco was at 30.6 nautical miles. The radar tracked for 41 seconds and went dark. No second launch. Whether the battery commander assessed the range as outside the C704's reliable engagement envelope, or whether a command element above the battery level terminated the engagement after the American fleet's response was detected inbound, or whether the radar activation was simply a post-engagement assessment track rather than a fire control preparation, the 41 seconds and no launch was the outcome the commanding officer's sprint had produced. He had sprinted his crew out of the engagement zone before the battery was ready to fire again. CENTCOM had received the Sirocco's flash transmission at 03:15:01. The targeting package had been assembled and transmitted upward before the near-miss debris had settled. Pre-delegation criteria: confirmed targeted attack against American vessel, crew members injured, confirmed EW geolocation of the battery position, window assessment open. The coordinates were good to within 30 meters from the AN/SLQ 32 capture of the fire control radar throughout both its active phases. Authorization at 03:19, 4 minutes after the near miss. 2 FA-18Es from the USS. Carl Vinson had been on combat air patrol 48 nautical miles to the southeast. They had received the preliminary targeting data at 3:16 and were already closing on the battery position when the authorization arrived. Time to target from authorization receipt, 7 minutes. The F/A-18Es arrived overhead at 03:26:51, 7 seconds after the battery's fire control radar had gone dark for the second time. The targeting pod resolved the position. 2 vehicles. The launcher was in reload configuration. The crew was mid-process on the C-704 reload sequence. The missile was partially loaded on the launch rail, the crew visible around it. They were loading the round that would have been the second shot. GBU-38 on the launcher vehicle at 03:27:14. The partially loaded C-704 on the launch rail produced a sympathetic detonation when the bomb hit. The missile's propellant load, even partially loaded, added to the primary explosion and destroyed the launcher vehicle and everything within 12 meters. The fire control radar vehicle, 20 meters from the launcher, was damaged but not fully destroyed in the secondary blast. Second GBU-38 on the radar vehicle at 03:27:31. Direct impact. Both vehicles confirmed destroyed. The battery that had put 9 meters between a warhead and 28 American sailors was gone in 17 seconds of strike execution. Total time from the near miss to the last bomb, 12 minutes and 31 seconds. The Sirocco's corpsman completed his medical assessment during the sprint. 7 crew members had sustained injuries in the blast and its aftermath, 4 with concussion symptoms from the overpressure wave, 2 with lacerations from equipment thrown by the explosion, 1 with a broken wrist from being driven against a console by the concussive effect. None critical. None requiring immediate surgical intervention. All 7 were treated aboard the ship and remained on duty or returned to duty within the patrol period. The armor plate fragment, the 3-inch steel shard that had penetrated 11 millimeters of bridgewing splinter armor and stopped in the foam backing behind it, was recovered during the damage assessment. The forensic analysis of its recovered position established that if the standoff distance had been 6 meters rather than 9, the fragment's velocity at the bridge wing would have been approximately double. The officer of the deck had been standing 18 inches behind the impact point. At 9 meters, she walked away. At 6 meters, she likely did not. The CIWS that was in maintenance is the finding the post-incident review spent the most time on, because the maintenance scheduling failure was systemic rather than individual. No single person had made an error. The maintenance had been scheduled correctly according to the applicable maintenance interval. The threat assessment elevation had occurred after the scheduling. The protocol for suspending non-critical maintenance during elevated threat periods did not specifically cover CIWS offline windows for patrol craft operating in threat-active zones. The gap. The protocol covered weapon systems that were in a degraded operational state, not systems that were entirely offline for scheduled maintenance. A CIWS that was partially functional during a maintenance window was covered. A CIWS that was completely offline was treated as a scheduled non-event. The protocol revision was straightforward. Any system offline for maintenance on a Cyclone-class patrol craft operating in a threat zone rated elevated or above requires explicit authorization from the Patrol Sector Operations Officer before the maintenance window begins, and requires suspension and restoration of the system to operational status if the threat assessment rises during the maintenance window. 2-minute procedure to authorize. 4-minute procedure to suspend the maintenance and restore operational status. Simple. The consequence of not having it was a 9-meter near miss with 7 crew members injured, and a fragment in foam backing that stopped 18 inches from an officer's head. The inertial-first, radar-second launch technique was the intelligence finding that required the most urgent fleet distribution. The technique had been observed in Iranian C-704 testing, but had not been previously employed in a combat engagement against American vessels. Its operational significance was immediate and specific. Every ship operating within C-704 range of the Iranian coast needed to understand that the EW detection window for this weapon could be compressed to 7 seconds or less, and that a Cyclone-class patrol craft without a functional CIWS had no intercept capability within a 7-second window. The distribution went out within 24 hours of the engagement. The technical brief covered 4 specific points: the launch sequence, the warning window compression, the effective range envelope and standoff calculation methodology, and the response actions available to a Cyclone-class crew in a 7-second window, which frankly were limited to the flash transmission and the sprint to safe standoff. The sprint protocol. That was the Sirocco's contribution to the fleet's doctrine beyond the technical brief. The commanding officer's standoff calculation, how far to sprint, how fast, what bearing, accounting for reload time, was documented in operational terms that every patrol craft skipper could apply. The formula is not complex. Know the battery range, know your sprint speed, know the reload estimate, compute the standoff time required, and execute the sprint immediately without waiting for CENTCOM authorization. The sprint is a survival action, not a tactical response that requires authorization. Sprint first. Transmit simultaneously. Let CENTCOM run the authorization process while the crew is doing the one thing available to them. Sprint first, the protocol that came from 9 meters and 7 seconds. The commanding officer received the Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal with Combat Phi. His crew received a unit citation. The citation was for the flash transmission quality, 6 words and a position in 7 seconds, as much as for the sprint. Because the flash transmission, arriving at CENTCOM at 031501 with accurate coordinates from the EW suite, was the data point that produced the 12-minute counter operation. The 6-word transmission was the beginning of everything that followed. The authorization, the F/A-18S already moving, the strike at 0327, 12 minutes from near miss to destroyed battery. The 6-word transmission was the first 12 seconds of those 12 minutes. The crew made a replica of the foam-backed armor plate with the recovered fragment mounted in the foam and hung it in the wardroom. Not as a decoration, as a number. The number is 9. 9 meters between the warhead and the hull. The fragment in the foam is what 9 meters looks like. In the Western Gulf, the Cyclone-class patrols continue. The CIWS maintenance clearance protocol exists now. The 7-second window is in the pre-deployment brief. The standoff sprint formula is in every patrol commander's notebook. The battery position on the Iranian coast is rubble, and a sympathetic detonation crater where the crew was loading the second shot when the bomb hit. 9 meters, 17 injured hands picking up the crew from the deck. 6 words that started the clock on 12 minutes. Let's go deeper into the intelligence failure that allowed the battery to occupy its firing position for 4 hours without detection. Because the pre-transit intelligence process that had cleared the Western Gulf corridor as safe had been based on satellite imagery that was current to within 6 hours of the engagement. 6 hours is a long time in a threat environment where a mobile launcher vehicle can drive to a prepared firing position, in place, compute, and wait. The pre-transit intelligence review for Cyclone-class patrol operations in the Western Gulf had been using a 6-hour imagery update cycle as its standard. The cycle had been designed around the assessed repositioning time for Iranian coastal defense assets. The previous intelligence estimate held that repositioning a coastal battery from storage to firing position required a minimum of 8 to 12 hours, based on observed behavior of the Nor and Qatar battery systems. The C-704 is a smaller system. Its launcher vehicle is lighter, faster to emplace, and faster to bring to a ready-to-fire status than the heavier Nor and Qatar systems. The emplacement time for a C-704 battery in a prepared alternate position, a position with pre-surveyed firing data already computed, is estimated at 2 to 3 hours, not 8 to 12. The 6-hour imagery update cycle that was adequate for Nor and Qatar batteries was not adequate for C-704 batteries. A C-704 battery could emplace in the gap between imagery updates and be ready to fire before the next satellite pass refreshed the picture. That gap, The mismatch between the imagery update cycle and the C704's emplacement timeline had not been identified as a vulnerability before the Sirocco engagement, because C704 batteries had not previously been used in combat engagements against American vessels in the Gulf operational record. The threat assessment framework had not been calibrated for a system whose emplacement timeline was faster than the surveillance architecture's refresh rate. The post-incident intelligence review produced two immediate modifications. First, the imagery update cycle for Cyclone-class patrol corridors in the Western Gulf was reduced from 6 hours to 3 hours, with additional tasking of persistent surveillance assets to maintain coverage of the identified C704 battery storage positions and transit routes. 3 hours is still potentially within a C704's emplacement window. The system can emplace in 2 to 3 hours, but it reduces the blind window from 6 hours to 3. Second, a behavior-based alert threshold was added to the imagery analysis protocol. Any vehicle movement consistent with a C704 launcher vehicle at any time within 3 hours of a scheduled Cyclone-class patrol entry into the corridor triggers a hold on the patrol until the movement is assessed. The hold adds a maximum of 90 minutes to the patrol schedule. Against a potential 9-meter near miss, 90 minutes is an acceptable delay. Both modifications required additional surveillance asset time and additional analyst capacity. Both were implemented within 2 weeks of the engagement at the cost of reduced coverage in lower priority sectors. The trade-off was made explicitly. The Western Gulf Cyclone-class patrol corridor was elevated in surveillance priority above several lower tempo areas. The operational planners who made that resource allocation decision were doing so in the context of a piece of foam-backed armor plate with a 3-inch steel fragment embedded 9 meters from where it would have been lethal. The decision was not difficult. The C704's inertial-first guidance technique had one additional implication that the post-incident technical analysis examined and the fleet distribution addressed. The technique provides a capability for conducting engagements during periods of American airborne reconnaissance that the standard launch technique does not. Under the standard fire control radar-first technique, an American P-8 Poseidon or RC-135 SIGINT aircraft monitoring the Gulf's electromagnetic spectrum will detect the fire control radar's pre-launch activation signature and can transmit a warning before the missile launches. The warning reaches the target ship while the missile is still on the ground. The ship has the full flight time, 60 to 120 seconds depending on range, to prepare its defensive response. Under the inertial-first technique, there is no pre-launch radar signature. The first detectable emission is the fire control radar activating after the missile is already airborne. If a P-8 or RC-135 is monitoring and detects the airborne radar activation, the warning still goes to the target ship. But the missile has been in the air for however long it took the system to detect the emission and generate the alert. At 7-second windows, that's a warning that arrives after the fact. The P-8 operating in the Sirocco's area had been at 18,000 feet, 85 nautical miles away. It had detected the Sirocco's own EW alert on the tactical data link and had processed the launch in progress data in parallel. Its contribution to the targeting package, a refined geolocation of the battery position from the airborne collection platform's angle, had reached CENTCOM and had improved the strike coordinate quality. The P-8 could not have provided earlier warning given the technique. What it did provide was better targeting data that contributed to a 12-minute response. The combination of the Sirocco's EW geolocation and the P-8's airborne collection angle had triangulated the battery position to within 25 meters from two different collection platforms at different bearings. That triangulation precision, two independent sources producing mutually reinforcing coordinates, was the reason the F/A-18's G BU-38s hit exactly what they were aimed at. The P-8 crew that processed the targeting data during the Sirocco's emergency was not in the post-incident citations. They were flying their watch, doing their job, contributing a targeting refinement that the strike execution depended on. The targeting data's precision was not an accident. It was the product of trained aircrew applying their collection capability in an emergency timeline, while simultaneously managing their own aircraft's position and communications. Every element of the 12-minute response depended on someone doing their specific job correctly under pressure. The Sirocco's EW operator capturing the battery emissions through both radar activations. The commanding officer's flash transmission in 7 seconds. The P-8 crew's targeting triangulation. The CENTCOM duty officer's 4-minute authorization. The FA-18 pilot's targeting pod employment against a vehicle mid-reload. 12 minutes is 20 people doing their jobs correctly in sequence. Miss any one element and the timeline extends. Extend the timeline, and the crew reloading the second shot gets it loaded. The crew was mid-reload when the bomb hit. In the Western Gulf, the Cyclone-class patrols continue. The CIWS maintenance clearance protocol exists now. The 3-hour imagery update cycle is running. The 7-second window is briefed at every pre-deployment training event. The sprint formula is in every patrol commander's notebook. 9 meters. The fragment in the foam. The Sirocco's crew knows the number. Stay vigilant. Stay informed. This is U.S. Defense Review. We'll see you in the next one.